We're now going to turn to the event of the morning, the dialogue with René Girard. Now, as I started planning this event, I talked with René, and I said, what role would you like to play? And he didn't feel like giving a keynote address as he used to do, but he said he'd be very open to engage in dialogue with somebody. And given the theme of the conference, we thought it would be really good to look at the connections between mimetic theory and peace. Walter Wink has spent an academic career really probing in a deep way issues around peace and the complexity of peace and what it means to stand up to domination systems that often fuel a lot of the violence in this world. He's been to South Africa, written a book about South Africa. He's put his own life on the line and his career on the line at times for the sake of peace. So I figured, okay, he's devoted to peace, and he knows Girard's work. In fact, he has a whole chapter in his book, Engaging the Powers, in which he engages Girard's ideas. So I figured, okay, this would be great. Duncan Morrow is another really good dialogue partner. Duncan has been working for peace for decades in Northern Ireland at the Corrymeela community. Furthermore, and legacy is important, we need to remember important people. One of the first people to actively use Girardian theory in the interests of peace building was Roel Kapteyn. How many of you here remember Roel Kapteyn? Well, those of you that don't, talk to these people. Roel Kapteyn worked closely with Duncan Morrow in the Corrymeela community, and so he brings that legacy of our cover history to bear on what's happening just now. So in order to start the dialogue, Walter Wink is going to make an introductory statement, and then we'll proceed. I guess I should say just a word of introduction to René Girard. I guess people know about his ideas, people know about him being part of the French Academy, but I've experienced him as a warm and open and sensitive fellow human being. And sometimes I think the highest compliment we can pay to somebody is to say that they're all-round great people. So I look forward to the coming dialogue together with all three of you.
To open the dialogue on creative mimesis and peace, Walter Wink dramatized two of Jesus' teachings on peace within the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, I'm a judge. She's a creditor.
At the time of Jesus, the Romans were in control of Judah, Samaria, and Galilee. Roman soldiers were in a position to make demands of the local population with impunity. Jesus instructs his hearers, if someone demands of you your outer coat, give him your inner cloak as well. In this dramatization, the jacket is demanded by the Roman. The subjected Jew keeps giving more and more clothing, from shoes and socks to shirt and pants. At the end, the Roman and the audience are embarrassed at seeing someone stripped to wearing only underwear. Likewise, the giving of the inner cloak in the time of Jesus would have left the Roman embarrassed, exposing the exploitative nature of the initial request. Roman policy prohibited soldiers from demanding the inner cloak, so the action would get them into trouble. The second teaching of Jesus concerns a Roman soldier who demands that a local person carry his bag for a mile. Jesus instructs his audience that if they are caught in this situation, they should carry it the second mile. In the dramatization, when the first mile is up, the Roman soldier asks for the bag to be returned, but the subjected Jew insists on carrying it a second round, much to the chagrin of the Roman. There were strict policies at the time restricting soldiers who wished to exploit the occupied population. They could only ask someone to carry a bag for 1 mile. By insisting on going the second mile, the exploited person embarrassed the soldier who risked being reprimanded, as was the case in the skit. According to Walter Wink's interpretive skit, Jesus was teaching people to be agents, capable of taking action in a situation in which they were oppressed. Wink made the point that what Jesus was advocating was a creative, symbolic act in the name of justice in the face of oppression.
I'm going to tell you how I reinterpret your little allegories, Whatever one does, his vis-a-vis tends to repeat. We call it reciprocity. We don't know what the word reciprocity means, actually. We don't know where it comes from. I mean, it's a real mystery. Some people think that it comes from the motion of the tide, back and forth. But whatever I do to you, you reciprocate. I offer my hand, you take it, we shake hands. But if you don't take my hand, and if you put your hand behind your back, I will also put my hand behind my back. In other words, I will reciprocate a friendly action, you will reciprocate it too. But if there's no good reciprocity, there will immediately be a bad one, which takes over. And this is what I think the specialists of human relations have not noticed enough, that far from lacking reciprocity, we cannot get out of it. But it's very easy to shift from good reciprocity to bad reciprocity, and terribly difficult to shift from bad reciprocity to good reciprocity. Because once we are in bad reciprocity, we keep turning around the room like you did, faster and faster, and it becomes more and more violent. It's very easy to shift to that. But to stop, I noticed you needed a third party. You needed an umpire, someone to arbitrate between you, And I think the problem of mankind is really precisely that whichever reciprocity we have, we are not going to be able to get out of it. It'll be a vicious circle into which things will always get worse and worse, and we don't really know why, anyway, because even good reciprocity, and this was one of the meaning of, can become bad by force of repetition, or, lose its appeal. But it seems to me that much of the contemporary theater studies that sort of thing, So what is the cause of that? And I think the cause of that is that we are very different from animals in that respect, I think that reciprocity begins with a glance. We look at each other. And this is a very striking thing, in my view, when you look at, animals fighting on TV, even the two goats that hit precisely the center of the forehead and so forth, they don't look at each other. They don't look at each other before the fight, during the fight, or after the fight. There is a total lack of glance. This is so true that Kipling had a special theory which was typical Kipling. He was a genius. But in the Jungle Book, there is that story that animals cannot stand the glance of man, which is human superiority. It's not true. If you look a cat in the eyes too long, the cat will be bored, will go to sleep. But men will never go to sleep. They'll rise to the challenge, and they'll fight. I think it is the good and the bad of man, It's inescapable. We are terribly mimetic, and being mimetic, inevitably, we are open to conflict. But it shouldn't be viewed, I don't think the mimetic theory views it only as a negative thing, you know. It's also a positive thing. We have relations. Animals don't have relations. Well, today, people talk about animal culture and that sort of thing, but they always have relations, which is like enslavement. You know, when they have these fights about dominance, that's the way the ethologists call it, you know, and these fights never lead to death. Because the defeated animal offers the defeated wolf, for instance, his throat to the victor. And out of this, a relationship is born which we call dominance. But dominance means that the victorious animal will always choose first. And the dominated animal can only choose what the other one doesn't choose. That's the relationship of dominance, which is the building block, really, of what ethologists call animal society. But as far as we know, it doesn't go any further than that. It doesn't have much diversity. If this is the way animal societies are born, you know, in the type of competition that you have for food, sex, and so forth, instead of moving to death, it moves to dominance. In human beings, if you had the same thing, they would kill each other. We know that. Human beings are the only kind of creatures, I say creatures in order to find a word that includes both human beings and, you know, I'm talking like a Darwinian ethologist here. If we allowed for that, we know very well what would happen. We would get into what we call vengeance. What is vengeance? Vengeance is doing what the other guy does, always the same thing, but it's the ultimate in bad reciprocity that I defined just before. The ultimate in bad reciprocity is to stop it by killing the opponent. And all men know how to do that, and only men do that, because animals don't have intraspecific murder. So, you know, when people say, oh, humans are violent and so forth, animals are much less violent, they are right. They are perfectly right. If we didn't have culture in the human sense, there would be no humanity. Humanity would have destroyed itself at birth. When the mimetic power rose in the relationship between animals, and we know that it rises, and we know it today scientifically through the mirror neurons. The higher you get, the more mirror neurons you have, and the more mirror neurons you have with men, the more you do the same thing. But this doing the same thing includes enough violence to kill. And we call it vengeance. We don't even know if vengeance is an institution, a custom, or instinct. We don't have any name, you know, for the thing which is probably most distinctive of human being. The human species is the only one which threatens its own existence from birth. We should be immensely aware of this now, because we do it with weapons that are so efficient that it's coming back to us at an incredible speed right this moment, you know. It's the main event of the 20th and 21st century, that man can destroy himself. That man, in other words, is an apocalyptic creature, like the Bible says, and no other religion does, you know. That should, if there are people on Mars who are watching us, they must be wondering why, even though we have scriptures that talk about the destruction of man by himself, we pay absolutely no attention to it now. We stopped paying attention to it when it became literally possible every day. Because in churches, we've stopped preaching eschatology and the end of times at the very moment when we became able to make it happen, you know. This, to me, is evidence that the Bible is not a religion like the other ones. that it knows about the origin and the end of man, things that are incomparable and that cannot be compared with any other religion. And it's linked to that mimetic power, because obviously fighting is an escalation. You know, we use the word escalation a lot today, but we should use it first for children fighting. It begins with a few words, you know, then there are more blows and so forth, and after that they try to do all the harm they can do to one another. Why? Because they are both doing the same thing, repeating, whatever you do to me, I'm going to do to you. If you treat me well, I will treat you well. But it's never the good aspect of it which dominates. Because it's so easy to imagine that aggression comes from the other. We insist on defining violence as aggression. And we are violent in the very doing of that. If violence, why do we want to define violence as aggression? Because we never feel aggressive ourselves. And we are not. We are mimetic. We imitate the aggression of the guy in front of us. Or at least we make him feel that we understand his aggressive intent. We don't feel aggressive at all, but we show him we understand he's aggressive. And he interprets that as our aggression, and vice versa, and so forth. The interpretation is always the same. Therefore, we always are in a situation where we need something between us to arbitrate. And the fundamental human situation is 3, not 2, you know. As long as it is 2, it is totally destructive. And of course, we talk only about love, but we practice only violence as we talk of love. That's why the mimetic theory is a critical theory. By critical, it means it suspects. You know, the modern world is essentially critical. And it's very easy to talk a good game of nonviolence. All cultures know that, how to do that. They do it perfectly well, but they all fight and fight each other. Therefore, we have to find something better. You see what I mean? And there have been, one could say, 3 great attempts to solve the problem in the modern world. I would say one is Marx, who says it's the economic goods that we cannot divide, we cannot share, and that's why we fight. The second one is Freud, who said, no, it's really sexual objects that we cannot share, and that's the real problem. And the third one is Nietzsche, who said a little bit the same thing in a more abstract way, who said it's power that we cannot share. And we have to fight. Nietzsche, in a way, understood less than the other two, because the other two took the need for peace for granted, and they were right. Whereas Nietzsche said, eternal war is fine with me. That's why Hitler was so dangerous, because he was the first great statesman to be Nietzschean and say war is our field and our domain, and let's do it. And we found that it was not only dreadful horror, but also a direct threat to all existing creatures on the earth. And we are at this stage. Well, the mimetic theory is a third attempt, and is trying to think in mimetic terms, in terms of what human relations really are, to be as virulent and dangerous as they are. Do we really understand that? Without the mimetic theory is my question. Are human relations, you know, something which can be described purely rationally, as Enlightenment humanism believed, that you could do away with religion completely, and then you could establish the perfect society on a purely rational basis? I think that our time is very important because it's beginning to realize it cannot be. It's not possible, you know. So the question is, can the mimetic theory make a contribution? That's what we are trying to find out.
As evidence that the mimetic theory starts to touch parts which other parts don't touch, I have to say that sitting here on this platform with you watching and him beside me takes away rational thought. It brings me right back to what I suppose I wanted to say from the very beginning, which echoes, I suppose, something which René has just said, which is that the profound insight of the mimetic understanding is, or there are so many, but one of them is, that this is not a rational pursuit. And it is particularly not rational once the escalation begins. It is particularly not a question. The choice is narrow the closer we get to the violence, as it becomes more and more simply reaction to the other. By way of my own experience in terms of living in Northern Ireland, one of the most profound and interesting issues coming at the back end of what we call our peace process, which I'll discuss later on tonight, is that it has left us with a nation of innocent people. Nobody did anything. And the only people who counteract that story are the injured and the bereaved and all those people around them. And it is absolutely clear that the political classes urgently want rid of them. And not just the political classes, all of the rest of us who support the political classes want rid of them. Because they constantly bring back into our attention that something happened here. Something extremely profound for which, and we don't want to know that either, we may have some responsibility. So to try to, first of all, say to, in response to René, the insight here is, when you're in this situation, what might take you out of it? And to bridge back then to Walter, to say that Jesus' answer, as I understand it, is, in the end, follow me. And follow me means that there is a third way between fight and flight, as long as we stick, literally, in the place which is the relationship with Jesus. In other words, we stick in mimetic relationship with what he shows in the end, not just teaches, because I actually think it's show, not tell. I really do think that, that ultimately the story is show, not tell. And so what I want to say here is this. For me, the really big challenge in finding response to being oppressed, being put down, being consistently is, how do we act so as to bring my situation and the other back into humanity, back to something like what we might call humanity. And it seems, and this is a hard thing for justice to say, that only if the person, that we are actually dependent on our victims to bring us back. That we have to, and so the question for me in the text that you give is that ultimately the question is, how, when you are being destroyed in a relationship, do we bring the other back into humanity? And it strikes me that the answer is, in a sense, given, and you demonstrated it very well, you have to somehow or other reveal what is going on. And the only way to reveal is not to reciprocate. It's not to fall into reciprocity. And so all these stories for me are stories about how is it possible to not fall into the mimesis of violence. And the only answer I get is that you go to the mimesis with Jesus. Now, I personally am very concerned about this language of good mimesis and bad mimesis, because I think it becomes very close to what I think we're trying to get out of, which is moralism. For me, it is When we are mimetic, for me, is a word which describes the fundamental reality of the human condition, which is we are dependent on and living in relationships. And the only question, really, in the end, is with whom or with what are we in relationship? And the defining question. And therefore, to redefine this question for me, anyway, of good and bad mimesis, with whom, when we are mimes with whom, and it is for me a who as well as a what, do we come into freedom? In other words, away from the reciprocity and away from the enslavement in this relationship and the fascination that goes with it. And with whom and in what circumstances am I in another place which is taking me into the fascination? And so good mimesis, I assume, is that when we are in relationship with things taking us into freedom, and bad mimesis is things which are taking us into the fascination with the violence. And I have to say, before I get too moralistic about this, the chances of getting dragged into the fascination are enormous, are absolutely enormous. I said about the lack of innocent people. When you hear the stories of people saying why they got involved with violence, they say, because I did not think I had a choice, because my community was being attacked, because I had to do something. There's always a rationalization for why it was done. And I understand it. I have to tell you at a profound and deep level, I am lying to you if I don't tell you why every time I don't understand it. Would I have done the same? If I faced that circumstance, I'm absolutely sure I probably would have. Unless I knew what I know now, which is I've just spoken to the person you've just injured, and I can't leave him behind me. So I suppose the radicalness of Jesus and the third way, I actually completely agree. The third, it's even wrong because it takes reference to the other two. A totally other way is possible here. And I absolutely agree that that other way does what at the last time I was ever at a cover, the only time I was ever at a cover conference was in Wiesbaden. And one of the most interesting seminars that I participated in was by a German theologian called Norbert Lofink, who talked about that the Christian challenge is to distinguish the difference between counterculture, which is simply reciprocity and getting into the relationship, and contrast culture, which is to live in a totally other reality and in this world. And that stuck with me as something of what Jesus, it came back to me when I was reading your work and saying, that's what Jesus is asking us to do, not to go into the counter culture, but stick with me in mimesis with me, and maybe a new world opens, not just for me, but for you as well, and in the whole relationship.
I would like to talk to you about your books on the principalities and powers.
Good.
That's how I knew you, you know. There is something in Paul, many of you know, of course, which is called the principalities and powers. And Walter Wing wrote 3 volumes about this, which were about 20 years ago, which have been quite successful. But so the first question to ask is, what are the principalities and powers? And there my disagreement with you begins. Because
It didn't last very long, did it?
I want to go. According to Paul, the principalities and powers are in charge of the world, I would say. You would agree with this. And they run the show. And Paul's attitude is, or seems to be, quite ambivalent toward them. They are opposed to Christ, even though they are really dominated by him. But Christ does not make his power over them, his superpower over them, visible in history. They are in charge, you know. And I will let Walter define them from the point of view of his book.
This is, I understand the principalities and powers as the systems, institutions, and structures which largely determine human existence.
Yeah, and I agree completely with that. You know, human beings have a culture, and human beings have a religious and political structure, you know, which is there, and the principalities and power in Paul designate that fundamentally. And Paul's attitude toward them is that they are still in charge, and that therefore Christians must obey them, must be good subjects of the kingdom of the world such as it is today, which really means the Roman Empire. Many people think that the expression principalities of power has been invented in a way not to use any word that would designate the Roman Empire too visibly and specifically. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's a secondary question. And the principalities and powers, it's difficult when you read Paul. At times they seem to be very bad, but they will be destroyed only at the end of the world when Christ gets in charge. So I think that the mimetic theory has things to say about the principalities and powers which are not immediately visible. There is a mirror effect between Christ and the principalities and powers, you know, which in a way I think modern anthropology reflects by telling us that most myths are really the same stories as the Gospels, fundamentally. You have a big crisis in the community, and then you have someone who is seen as responsible for that crisis, who's committed a big crime in myth, and is justly punished for it, and that crisis is over. Oedipus, for instance, has committed parricide and incest. And if you punish him, you will put an end to the plague which has invaded Thebes, because Thebes has never punished Oedipus, but done just the opposite, made him his king. You see what I mean? Her king. In the Gospels, you have a big crisis, because the world is dominated. The little Jewish kingdom is slowly destroyed by the Romans, who are there occupying the thing. And then, in a way, the Gospels represent the death of Jesus as some kind of attempt at finding a scapegoat that would solve the solution. And in a sense, that's the only reason for the crucifixion, according to the Gospels. Therefore, anthropologists are completely right when they say myth, Gospels, fundamentally, same structure, same story. You see. Christians have rejected that view very much because they are terribly scared of it, because they fear it's the old modern unbelief of saying the gospel is a myth. Isn't it? It is, of course. It doesn't mean that Christians should reject that view. It means that they should agree with it even more. They shouldn't go against common sense. Christianity is much more commonsensical, as well as Judaism, as people realize. there is a huge difference that you see immediately if you understand what a scapegoat process is, and that you will see if you read with simple enough eyes the Gospels versus a myth. The similarities I just defined are there. They are unquestionable. They are so striking that to deny them is to go against common sense, you know. So today, in a way, it's modern common sense that is anti-religious. They are only myths. Look, they are all the same. There is always the death of a hero there who is accused of something. And they don't see that difference, which is so huge. It is so simple. And the truth is that the difference between myth and the Gospels is revealed by the Gospels, but we don't want to look at it. And the Christians, the religious people, are terribly bad anthropologists, whereas the atheists are a little better, just a little better, but not very good either. You see, in order to be a good anthropologist, what do you have to say and to see? Is that the myth, they have all something in common, which is that they read that story from the point of view of the mob. The victim is guilty. Oedipus has committed parricide and incest. Even Freud believes in it. We live in a mob. Freud denounces himself the mythical aspect of his psychoanalysis in the sense that he shows us it's a myth. To believe in the parricide and incest is to believe in the Oedipus myth. And Freud believes in it, whereas Christianity doesn't. Christianity and Judaism before, which is terribly important, they all interpret the story from the point of view of the victim. The victim is innocent and not guilty. It's not just friendship for Jesus or friendship for Joseph or friendship for Job that you give a voice to the victim in the Bible. It's to tell the truth. It's the mob that is wrong. It's the crowd. It's the people who are wrong. That's why Christianity is hated in our world. Because far from being, you know, the popular religion and so forth, it's the anti-popular religion. It denounces what the crowd believes. The crowd always believes in the guilt of the victim. The Bible and the Gospels never. And look around, look in the landscape. You'd never have that problematic, that mythical problematic again. It's never rectified anywhere except in a few books of the Bible and in the Gospels. Therefore, the few books of the Bible and the Gospels are inseparable. They are the only books which denounce religion in the normal human sense. The problem, of course, with all religions, including Christianity, is that it has become a religion in the normal human sense. And in the process, it has been unfaithful to itself and deserves some of the strictures. So the people, in a way, the Christians feel that, and they are afraid of anthropology. But it's a total reversal of viewpoint there. But if you start thinking about it very hard, you will see that it's a purely scientific theory. It's obvious that some people do commit incest, others parricide. But parricide and incest at the same time, that's too much. No. That's unbelievable. It's obviously a false accusation. And Freud was completely wrong when he thought that it was a unique insight of the Oedipus. It's all over the place in the Pacific Ocean, in the Americas, and so forth. It's the most vulgar mythical story. Vulgar in the etymological sense. It's a mob story. When you have an enemy in a bar and you're fighting, you say insults that are equivalent to the Oedipus myth. Sophocles knew that when he wrote Oedipus the King. He had Oedipus and Tiresias fight from which the myth is born. And at the end of the scene, they accuse each other both of them, of parricide and incest. But we believe only one, and we call it culture. We believe only one is guilty. But as long as we don't realize all are innocent of that murder, you know, and the victim, not all are guilty of that murder, and the victim alone is innocent, you know, we don't understand myth, and we don't understand the Gospels that overturn myth 100%. But I see people are interdit, as we say in French, you know. It's just too paradoxical. But Christianity is immensely paradoxical. That's what Kierkegaard understood, but he never could formulate that business about anthropology, archaic anthropology, and the anti-mythical aspect of the Bible and Gospels. Human culture lives in a permanent lie until it reaches that truth, that the lie is to make the victim guilty, to make the victim different. Culture is difference. As long as we don't have difference, we are not happy. And ultimately, we turn. So now we've reached the extreme, and we see that the Gospels are responsible. Today, the great fashion is to see that religion is responsible for violence in the world. That's what you hear on TV every day. And the ultimate scapegoat should be religion, because the sense of religion is precisely that. It's always the scapegoating, you know. Now, people don't understand what I'm talking about because they don't understand the most fundamental thing about scapegoating. When people come and tell me, oh, I understand fully your story, your business, you know, you cannot believe how scapegoated I am. I said, go away, this is everybody's story. I want to hear the story which is nobody's story. And it's a story of Peter. When he realizes he's betrayed Jesus, he realizes that the scapegoater is he, and that Jesus is a scapegoat. And Paul, Peter is the first conversion in the Gospels, and Paul is the last one. But Paul, contrary to what people realize, it's exactly the same story as Peter. What does he hear? Peter sees it in Luke, at least in the eyes of Jesus, you know, and Jesus has announced the truth to him before. So what is essential about Peter's denial is his awareness that he has betrayed. We all betray without realizing it. I mean, no century has been a century of apostasy as ours, but it doesn't realize it's apostate, essentially. You see? And what is the question that Paul hears? Why do you persecute me? You know. Thank you.
Duncan, I think, is ready to.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. Yes,
I'm always ready to talk. Question of turning it off. I mean, I suppose I want to defend the atheists a little bit. Just a little bit. In the sense that it strikes me that the first insight of the Jewish people or the Hebrew people in the desert is that the old gods had failed. And in fact, they're right. The first and the culturally significant insight of the Hebrews in the desert is that the pharaonic system is a lie. And so, in the sense, if atheists are saying old religion is a lie, then I agree. Then I agree. And because this word religion and Christianity as religion and the rebellion against Christianity as religion is all mixed in with one another. And it is as if everything gets thrown out and we then live in this kind of desert without any direction of where we're going. And I suppose that's how I understand what postmodernism is all about. It's trying to pretend it doesn't matter that we don't have a direction, having given up with the old things and not willing to go to the new things. And I suppose my feeling is not so much that that atheism has, in that sense, or modernity has, at one level, is both an opportunity because we can't go back,
That's a
and
real
is
question.
another one is a danger, that we stand in this cusp between having discovered that the old gods are dead. What now do we do? Who do we follow? And it strikes me that what I don't want to do is end up in some kind of new mimetic rivalry with atheists in this kind of game, which is, you must believe, you have to believe is rubbish. It must be then that we take seriously what we know, which is somebody has to start not worrying about what they're doing and actually just following. I'm going to say follow me, which is I would advise you not to do, but
My question,
follow him.
Yeah.
And just
Follow him.
It's got to be my method.
yeah, but at the same time, you know, if Christianity is true, which you imply, to a certain extent,
Yeah, no, I agree.
why choose as your enemy the religious people rather than the atheist, you know? I think it's irrelevant.
Either.
In a way, the question is, the archaic religions, which put the burden on the human victim, and which were wrong, and Christ has proved it, you see, at the same time were absolutely indispensable to take us out of animality into humanity. So I think one of the things the biblical religions say is that they assume the burden of religion too. And there is no more reason. The most radical position is to assume religion in toto and to realize that Christianity and the Bible and Judaism are the summit of it. You see what I mean? Because it's a most radical position, ultimately. But it's a radicalism, so radicalism that it hasn't been invented. I think that the mimetic theory is inventing it. Yeah.
Okay, Robin.
Yes, I just have one quick question. And may have read what you said about this before.
Sure. But the proof of that Christianity is also a logical thing is in Plato, you know, because there are two things. There is that famous passage in the Republic where a minor character says, if there were a perfect human being who wouldn't do any harm to his neighbors and who would be morally perfect, he would be killed. In other words, Simon Weil, you know, considered this to be one of the great pre-Christian intuitions of Simon Weil. And I think he was right. In certain ways, Socrates is an approximation of this, but I think only an approximation. Because the thing about the Gospels, which is absolutely unique, and the Bible, is that they speak about their true nature in a way that theologians have not yet discovered. I'm going a little far there, but I will. Just before the Passion, Christ asked the people who listened to him, explain to me this sentence from Psalm 118, no? The stone that the builders rejected has become the keystone. It's a mimetic theory of religion. How does it apply to, it applies both to the archaic gods in one way, in its violent significance, and it applies to the biblical heroes in its non-violent significance. But why haven't the theologians talked about that question? And since no one answers it in the Gospels, try to answer it themselves. Have you ever seen a theologian doing that? Doesn't it have more authority than Greek religion? Should it not have priority for them over Greek questions? This incredibly Jewish question. No one. But I think the significance is obvious. The stone that the builders rejected is the victim, not only Christ, but all the victims before. If we understand that myth is myth, it's because deep down we understand Christianity. That's why we cannot escape it. We know that myths are wrong, and we hope that Christianity is wrong too, because it puts such a burden on us. But it's Christianity, the Gospels, that, and books like Job and the Psalms too. In the Psalms, no one notices, the people who comment on them, that in more than 80 of them, it is a victim who is speaking before being lynched by a mob. And this victim is asking God to be violent against his enemies. But one should see the circumstances. The Psalms are the first religious texts in history that make the victim speak before it dies. And the book of Job is nothing else. Job is a man who says, I was your little dictator in this village. You all worshiped me. One fine morning, I wake up, everybody's against me. I've become the scapegoat. And I'm the lowest of the lowest. The scapegoats, the people who live outside the town, they are better off than me now. Why did you shift that way? The question is never answered. But the question is not even posed by the critics of the Job book. That the real subject of the Job book is a leader who is rejected by his people. Therefore, that's why it's prophetic of Jesus, because all the prophets die the same way. The mob is for them at first, the crowd, and then turns against them. And Jesus says, I will die like the prophets. Therefore, Jesus knows that story, and it's because he knows it and talks about it, says that the same will happen to him.
My question would be, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I have so much respect for Walter and for obviously all three of the panelists. The moral dilemma happens not when I'm being struck. When I'm being struck, there's a question. Do I have the courage of my convictions? And who knows? I pray that I would, but I might not. The moral dilemma comes up when I see somebody else being struck. And the question is, what is my responsibility at that point?
The question of the Gospels about Satan being expelled by Satan or by God. The expulsion of Satan by God is certainly non-violent. It's something we cannot understand. And ultimately, the only weapons at our disposals are Satan's. When we think in terms of expelling even evil,
My question is for the three of you, and particularly to Mr. Girard. It's how do we work for world peace? Because it's easy to speak about Jesus, but most of the world is not Christian, and it's difficult to give Jesus as an example for people that are Muslims or Buddhists. What can we imagine other models that can act like Jesus for people from other traditions?
This is very obvious when you read Paul. No, because Paul doesn't say, imitate Jesus. He says, imitate me. He cuts things short. You know, so some people say he's very dictatorial and so on. No. Since he imitates Jesus, who imitates his Father, it's the same thing. You have a chain of imitators. It doesn't matter. As long as they imitate the right model above them, they're okay. So it seems to be hierarchical, but it's non-hierarchical. But Paul always says, imitate me. You know, so people question is, and so forth, but I think it's wrong. It's in a complete application of his idea that imitating someone who imitates Jesus the right way. Of course, so he may be presumptuous in thinking he imitates Jesus the right way, but it's according to that principle that he says, imitate me. You know.
Let me just say one brief thing that takes us back to the exegesis. We laughed a lot when we were doing that, but it was a very serious rewriting of that passage. And I want to